let me go to John Ziegler. John is a senior columnist at Mediaite. He is the host of Individual One podcast. He has written a great couple of stories now on this bombshell that ends up blowing up the New York Times on Brett Kavanaugh. Welcome to the program, John. How are you?
Always good to be with you, Glenn.
Yeah. So, John, let's start with the Kavanaugh story that you wrote on Sunday. It was a fascinating story about, how much they really left out of this story. It's not just that the accuser has no accusation because they don't remember any of it. It's who made this allegation.
Yeah, well, it's actually, Glenn, it is almost impossible to fully encapsulate all the problems with the New York Times story in one column. I mean, I'm being very literal about that. And I actually think that while the conservative media has done a really good job on some aspects of the story, there are obvious aspects like the one you just mentioned that they didn't mention. Oh, by the way, the alleged victim of the second episode that is supposed to be this bombshell has no knowledge of this, and her friends say that they don't believe that it happened. They leave that out. That would be a big enough problem as it is. But I think we're missing something with regard to who the witness is. And it's not just political bias. This guy is a guy by the name of Max Stier. And when I read the original article, I didn't know who Max Stier was. And it referred to him as a thought leader who works at a D.C. nonprofit. Now, I have a pretty, I have a pretty good BS detector. But when I read that, I'm like, wow,
that's
I'm
like
at 11.
The Patriot Act.
I'm at an 11 on who this guy is.
Right.
So who is this guy? Well, we now learn that he was one of Bill Clinton's defense attorneys during his impeachment, which would automatically show at least some bias. But I'm not even worried about the bias element or the potential political motivation. Let's go back to the Clinton impeachment. Who was on the other side of that battle? Ken Starr's primary deputy was Brett Kavanaugh. What was one of the major allegations against Bill Clinton that led to that whole situation? Him exposing himself to Paula Jones, which started that lawsuit. So let's go back to this, Glenn. Let's think about the absurdity of this. So Glenn Stier, in the midst of this incredibly intense impeachment battle, knows that his classmate from Yale, Brett Kavanaugh, is a guy who he witnessed doing exactly the same thing that Bill Clinton is being accused of, and he never mentions this to anybody?
That is such an amazing piece of evidence. That to me, when I read this from you yesterday, I thought to myself, that is the most damning piece of evidence on this article than anything else. They didn't think that the guy who was coming after his client, Bill Clinton, that attorney had witnessed him do exactly the same thing as he was investigating on the president, and he wouldn't bring that up. He wouldn't expose that. Impossible.
Exactly. And what's remarkable to me is that I'm the only one I know of that's really made a big deal out of this.
Yeah.
And it's not because I'm any great shakes. As you guys know, I'm very disoriented in this story because I'm actually defending somebody I like, and I might actually win on this one. That's very strange for me. That never happens. So, but I really honestly believe that the biggest problem here is that there's so many issues in the story. I mean, they leave out their biggest bombshell. There is a bombshell in this new book by these Times reporters who clearly now, as we're learning more, snuck this into the New York Times. This was snuck in on a weekend in a story that was labeled something totally different about Yale's culture, and they snuck these things in there that did not pass muster on the news side. But the biggest bombshell this book has isn't even in the article, which is that Leland Kaiser is now on the record for the first time. Leland Kaiser, Christine Ford's best friend at the time, who was allegedly at this party, which has no place and no date, no year even, no way of getting home, no way of getting there, all sorts of problems. But she is now on the record saying that it makes no sense to her, this story, and that she has no confidence in it, and that she was the victim of an intimidation campaign of Ford allies to try to get her to lie on her behalf. Ladies and gentlemen, you don't have to go to journalism school to know that's an actual bombshell. And that's not even in the story. And it's not in the story because it doesn't fit the narrative that the New York Times and their liberal subscriber base wants. In fact, they would probably have gotten irate if the New York Times had given that the weight that it deserved, because I believe it shows that Brett Kavanaugh is an innocent man, not someone who you can't prove this about. He's totally innocent, and that the Ramirez story that this Times piece was focused on is an urban legend. You want to know the closest thing I can come up with to this? Remember the Richard Gere gerbil story?
Yeah.
That's what this is. This is maybe somebody actually did have a gerbil removed from them in a hospital sometime, and then it somehow got attached to Richard Gere's name. Well, Brett Kavanaugh was the most famous person to come out of that fraternity at Yale. Something happened to Deborah Ramirez, and many, many years later, when it became politically feasible, it got attached to Brett Kavanaugh, and that's what happened here. It did not actually happen. There's zero evidence, when there should be plenty, that Brett Kavanaugh did anything to Deborah Ramirez, and I believe that the Ford story is a therapy-created memory where Ford was trying to save her marriage and came up with a reason for why she was a nut job, and used Brett Kavanaugh because he was also famous at the time, she's a lefty and he's a righty.
I will tell you this. I think this is the first time that you don't really have he said, she said in this particular case that they are running on now, and trying to impeach him today, trying to get to Congress to go along to impeach him on this story.
They all jumped on it before they had any of these facts. All
Correct.
these politicians, Ocasio-Cortez and Kamala Harris, they all just ran with it with no evidence at all.
Correct. So they have this, but because of who made the allegation, the former Clinton attorney, now you have something where you can look at that and say, there's no way. There's no way this is true, because he would have used it at that time. There's absolutely no way this is true.
And 100%, but let's even go farther with that. He also doesn't do an interview with the New York Times. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you, if you know anything about political operatives, that he took his shot when he thought there was a chance of Kavanaugh going down. And now that Kavanaugh is confirmed, he's like, I don't want anything to do with this because I don't even have a victim that backs me up on this. Maybe his memory contrived something in the midst of the chaos. Who the hell knows? That was a very strange time during the confirmation hearings. But clearly, he has no confidence in his own story, because if he did, he'd be wanting to tell everybody, and that he would be thrilled if the Times wanted to revisit this, because even the Senate Democrats didn't take his story seriously. They knew about it, and they passed it off to the FBI.
So, John, I want to ask you now for an opinion as a guy who writes about the media. What the hell is happening? I mean, is there any sense at all from anyone in mainstream media that it's like, okay, this has gone far enough. I can't do this anymore?
I don't. Well, to answer your question, I don't think so yet. I wrote a second column about this today, which you can find on my Twitter feed, Zygmunt Freud and at Mediaite, about why this happened. And I think you'll agree with this column when you get a chance to take a look at it, because it's about the culture of the left-wing mainstream media. And you have swum in those waters, as have I, on numerous occasions. And it is my opinion that there was no one in the room when these decisions were being made about this story who has a mindset of, someone like you or someone like me or Stu, who might go, guys, hold on a second here. Not everybody is already convinced that Brett Kavanaugh is a sexual predator. I mean, everybody in that room believes that. And so therefore, there's not a lot of scrutiny on the alleged evidence that that's the case, because they already know it to be true, even though it's not. And so there's nobody on the other side to go, hold on. And then there's the worst part of this, in my view, is the incredible amount of arrogance. I mean, people who work at the Times are unbelievably arrogant. I mean, God could tell them one of their stories is wrong, and all they would do is pass it off for a second fact check. I mean, they really do believe that if it's in the Times or if a Times reporter says it's true, that it must be true, and that's no longer the case because. Frankly, staffs have been cut. Fact checking is no longer what it was. There's a rush to get stories out there. And this is the other element, they are now beholden to a liberal subscriber base and to nut jobs on Twitter who are effectively editing their newspaper. And I think that's why they left the Leland Kaiser quote out. Because if they put that in there, they would have pissed off a whole lot of their liberal nut job subscriber base. And that's not the way you run a newspaper of record. It's just a business. That's all it is.
All right.
Their business model is appealing to liberals.
All right, I've got about 2 minutes, but I can't let you go without saying, wow, how did you feel when Malcolm Gladwell writes a book and a chapter is about Penn State and he uses most of your stuff and says, I think John Ziegler is right?
Yeah. Well, considering the hell I've been through in the last 7 years, other than the one day I spent with you guys talking about this story, which was a reprieve, I was a little bit shocked, to say the least, although I've been working on Malcolm for quite a while. I've done an interview with him I hope people will check out from my World According to Zig podcast. You can also find that at the top of my Twitter feed. I hope people will take a look at it. 10 years ago, Glenn, I believe that Malcolm Gladwell, looking at the Penn State Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky case and saying, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Take a look at what John Ziegler has done, would have potentially changed the world. We don't live in that media climate anymore.
No, we don't.
Much like with Brett Kavanaugh. And by the way, the Kavanaugh story and the Penn State story are remarkably similar in many, many ways. And the bottom line is neither of them are true, and there's no evidence to suggest they're true. It's all about politics. And I hope people will take another look. I was gratified, but I'm also a realist, Glenn. And so
no, you're not. You are a bigger pessimist than I am. You're not a realist. You're like everybody is bad. Everything is against everything. We're all going to die.
If you would live my life on this Penn State thing, you'd be agreeing with me, Glenn. I can assure you. But I was glad to get some sense of vindication. It might extend my marriage for another couple of years.
John Ziegler, freespeechbroadcasting.com. You can follow him on Twitter at Zygmunt Freud. Zygmunt Freud is that. You can find him on the Individual One podcast and read him at Mediaite. Well worth listening to, well worth considering John Ziegler's opinion on many things.
Yeah, I listened to that podcast, by the way, with Malcolm Gladwell. I mean, he was unequivocal.
Yeah.
Like he said, I think it was something like, I am ashamed to live in a world in which these people went to prison.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
I
think that's real good vindication for John Ziegler.
Yeah.
John, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.